We now turn to the teleological argument. The teleological argument comes from the Greek word telos, and telos means goal or purpose. And so a telos is, that which you aim towards, that which you have a goal or purpose. And so sometimes it also is called the end, but it's the end insofar as it's what you're aiming at. For example, a race has an end, and that would be its telos in Greek. But it's also what you're aiming at. You're aiming at making the end of the race. If you're shooting archery and you're shooting at a goal, that's your telos. It's what you're aiming at. And so the idea here is that if you look at the world, that the world is complex enough that somebody was aiming to make it, is basically what the argument is. Now, in this case, what it does is, whereas with the cosmological argument, all it does is make this initial judgment that something exists. With the teleological argument, it makes a judgment that the world exists, but that the world is too complex to have happened without somebody having had a goal or purpose in mind when they were building the world. So what happens here is that the world is so complex, it requires somebody to have made it. Now, the guy that oftentimes gets brought up is William Paley. He's a guy who comes up with this thing called the watchmaker's analogy. And the watchmaker's analogy is basically an argument that suppose you're walking along a deserted island. You've gone into, you've been in a shipwreck, you're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and you wash up on an island that's the size of, a football field, right? And so you're walking around the edges of the island and along the beaches, and while you're walking, you look down and you see a watch, a pocket watch, and you wind it and it works and it keeps perfect time, at least as best you can tell. And, you're really like, wow, this is this is amazing. Now, nobody is going to look at that and go, oh, well, it must have just been a freak accident that this watch existed. No, the existence of the watch is evidence that somebody built it, designed it, that somebody created it. The complexity of that watch requires that there has been a watchmaker. It would be absurd. It would be absurd to think that this watch came about by accident. That what happened was, one day the sun hit the sand just right and caused it to melt down into glass, and then a little piece of metal washed up on shore in a perfect circle, and the glass fell on top right before a leaf dried up into a piece of paper somehow, and a squid squirted some ink, causing the numbers to end up on the watch. I mean, you just kind of come up with some far-fetched scenario. No, the fact that this thing works and is all there is evidence that there must have been something behind it to create it. There must have been a goal or purpose. That somebody looked at this watch, at these parts, and said, I need to build this into something. And so the fact is that's what the telos is, that there was a purpose behind it. And so when you look at this, you realize that this thing had a purpose. Well, the teleological argument does the same thing, and it says, but we look at the world and we say, hey, there has to have been something that created this. The world is too complex and too well organized for it not to have had a designer. That somebody had to be behind it. Just as the watch did, so must the world. That you look at, like, for example, like the human body. If you didn't have a heart, it wouldn't work. If you didn't have eyes, if the eyes didn't have cones and rods and a brain and all kinds of nerve cell endings. That is a very complex piece of machinery that creates our bodies, even, for example. And so there had to be something that was behind it, designing it. And that's the basic argument. Now, as we move along into more modern times, we begin to say, well, maybe that's not so complex. For example, suppose you were walking along that beach, but instead of finding a watch, you found a lever. A lever. This is what Archimedes said, give me a place to rest my lever and I shall move the world, right? I mean, a lever, the most powerful thing that allows us to move things of great weight and just to move them with great ease, right? A lever is basically like a rock You put a stick on it, right, like a teeter-totter, and then you push, right? Right? You use it, and you can then take something and you go, and it pushes it way away, right? Yeah, a lever. It's an awesome thing, right? And so, you know, if you walked along and you were walking along that same beach and there was a big rock with a stick sitting on top of it, you might go, wow, somebody had to be here to make the lever, right? Well, I think a lot of people would say, well, I mean, rocks sometimes just end up on islands. Nobody has to be there to put a rock there. And the fact that a stick washes up on top of it, maybe during high tide or during a storm, that's really nothing that special. This may not be a lever. You may perceive it to be a lever, but it's not really that complex. It's not really that special. That can happen by accident. And that's basically the argument against the teleological argument. The teleological argument was created at a time before Darwin came along. And Darwin comes along and says, well, you know, some of these things could happen through gradual change over time, that we could have evolution. And so maybe it isn't the case that this world is as complex as we want. Maybe it's not as significantly troubled. But at least before that time, there was really no reason to explain it. Before Darwin, I think we all kind of come to this assumption that, you know, 200 years ago, people would have been able to see it. No, not until Darwin, around, you know, during the 1800s, would we have had any concept that the world might have been too complex to have happened with anything other than via God. But what the teleological argument does is it still suggests that there are a lot of complexities and perhaps there is a God. And the other side of the teleological argument is what we maybe call in more modern times is what we might call intelligent design. It's the idea that maybe these things could come about through an evolutionary process, but that God is still behind them, orchestrating them. That, you know, for example, like I want to avoid, I just moved in and there was all kinds of, there were some big spots of dirt where they had done some digging along where I live. They'd done some digging along the out part of the house to do a termite inspection, and they had left some of the dirt unturned, and I don't know why they dug trenches, but they had, and so I didn't want my kids to get in that, and so I took some pine needles that were coming off the white pine this fall, and I put them around over the dirt, over the areas. I smoothed out the dirt and then put it over the top so that it would create something that would keep it from getting my children muddy. And then grass and other things can grow up underneath it. And as a result, I will be able to basically avoid the mud. And so one way for me to get that done is through a natural process of, you know, take foliage that is, you know, dying in the winter, pile it along the places I want it, and then let the grass grow in. And so it is something that happened with design, even though it used nature to do it. And the idea here is that we can do the same thing with God, that God may be, in fact, using natural forces in order to bring about change. One complaint sometimes comes along that this leaves kind of a God of gaps, that God is really just a placeholder to explain some of these things, and God isn't really of any significance. And I think that's a fair complaint at times, but at the same time, it is the case that it's saying basically God is using this as a way of bringing about change in the world.